and an MA from Cambridge. He then came to the US, where he completed an MA and MPhil at Columbia before earning his PhD in 1997, also from Columbia. Right away, he came to Duke, where he began as an assistant professor of history in 1998. He served as APSI's faculty director from 2009 to 2015, and has frequently served as APSI's director of graduate studies. From 2022 to 23, he was the chair of the history department here at Duke. He has received numerous grants and awards that helped advance Asian and Japanese studies at Duke and in the Triangle, including one from the Japan Foundation, which helped establish the Triangle Center for Japanese Studies, a network that includes scholars at UNC Chapel Hill and NC State. Other grants from the Department of Education helped establish a National Resource Center at Duke from 2006 to 2015, and his own research has been supported by the Humboldt Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, Fulbright, and Rikkyō University, to name a few. He has published widely, both books and articles, and is well regarded as an expert on the history of 19th and 20th century Japan, covering topics such as the growth of consumer markets, technology and social change, and Japanese rural society. His newest book, Koume's World, looks at the life and work of a samurai woman before and after the Meiji Restoration, a major turning point in Japan's history. Today, he will share some insights from his time researching this project, which has been called a compelling micro-historical study of gender, economy, and society in 19th century Japan. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pertner.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Renata, for that very generous introduction. Thanks to APSI staff, Renata and Alex, and also the center's staff, Erin, Rhiannon, and others for organizing this wonderful series. And I'm grateful to be invited and happy to share. Thanks also to everyone on Zoom for coming out, for joining us, and for those who came out here, many thanks to you. Nice to see you all again. Since this is a relatively short event, I have like one or two presentations that I've given before on this book, but I feel like they're all too long. So I'm gonna be a little impressionistic instead, and thought it might be fun just to reflect on sort of my own experience as I wrote this book during the COVID pandemic, and some of the, I think insight is maybe too strong a word to use, but some of the what I felt to be sort of uncanny parallels that I found between my experience of COVID, or rather watching COVID globally, and the project that I was working on. So firstly, just briefly to introduce the project, it's about the life of this lady, Kawai Koume. This is actually not a painting done during her lifetime, long afterwards. We have no image of what she actually looked like. But she lived, as you can see, through most of the 19th century, and she kept a diary for much of her life. Only parts of it have survived, but it was my main source for writing this book. And it was a very, very vivid, wonderful document, although of course it leaves, like all such documents, leaves many questions and gaps, that some of which I tried to answer, others I realized that I was never going to be able to answer. This was a challenging project for me in many ways, perhaps a little naive of me to enter into it in the first place. This is basically an early modern Japan project. In Japanese studies, we have a rather clear delineation between early modern and modern, January 1868. And most of her diary does actually go beyond the 1868, and I do write about the period after that. But most of it is about the previous period, and what I'm going to talk about today is the early modern period. Also, of course, this is women's history, and I am far from being a scholar of women's history, as I was reminded of by my outside readers rather sternly when they read my first draft. And I'm also, she was an artist, and I am also not an art historian, and I had to struggle a lot really to keep up, and I'm still waiting for the for the reviews. I actually there were no art historians as outside readers, so I guess the critiques there are going to come in the review stage. But it was really also a fun project to do. She was as Renata mentioned, she was from a samurai family, not upper ranking, but actually quite sort of middle to lower rank, and quite poor. The samurai were not a wealthy group of people by this point in time. the merchants having really taken over a lot of the economic power. And she was, she was born into a family of scholars. She herself married a scholar. She was quite scholarly. She was well educated. In that sense, she, I guess, was somewhat of from an elite group. She had one child, a son, who also became a scholar. So there were actually, I think, 4 generations, father to son, who were scholars working in the domains, a school run by Wakayama Domain, which was where she was born. So she was born, this is not progressing. Thank you. So this is just what her diary, the actual diary looks like. I'm happy to say that I did not have to work with this handwritten document. Her grandson, her great-grandson transcribed it and had it published. She was born in the city of Wakayama right here. So yeah, here is Osaka, Kyoto, which at the time, of course, was the seat of the imperial family and the notional capital of Japan, quite far from the city of Edo, now Tokyo, which is all the way up the coast up here. About 10 to 14 days walk, even if you're walking quite fast. But this is a wealthy peninsula, has wonderful resources in the ocean, the forests, some rice land as well. And the lord of this domain, Wakayama Domain, also known as Kishu, was a member of the Tokugawa family, so a very senior, it was a very senior domain among the 250 odd domains that existed in Japan at this time. Wakayama was maybe the 8th largest city, I believe, and I think the 5th wealthiest domain. I actually I went to Japan in August of 2019 in order to spend a year, it was supposed to be the final year, researching and then writing up this document. I was extremely lucky because there is a group of wonderful local historians in Wakayama. So Koume is not at all well known outside Wakayama. There's very little published about her, but within Wakayama, she has a dedicated following. This is incidentally, Wakayama unfortunately was completely flattened by the Americans at the end of World War II and in the last months of the war. Really nothing is left of the original samurai town. This castle is a faithful reproduction that was built in the 1950s. And yes, as I said, I would go every month actually to Wakayama during the last months of 2019 and meet with this lovely group of local historians, mostly quite elderly, but then I felt quite at home with them actually, wonderful people, all of them, and incredibly helpful to me with my research. They have a little group there called the Society for the Enjoyment of Koume's Diary, so I became a member of that. And then in early 2020, COVID-19 came to Japan. And it actually came somewhat earlier to Japan than to the United States. So, we were aware of it and scared of it before it was really on people's radars here that something bad was going to happen. We had some alarming incidents quite early on. I don't know how many of you remember the Diamond Princess cruise ship that was marooned in Yokohama Bay for weeks while most of the people on it caught COVID, and quite a number of them actually died. It was and we were also, of course, watching these very horrifying images from Wuhan, as everyone else was. We also had cases in Kyoto and Tokyo. I was living in Kyoto at this time, quite early, long before they started in the United States. Very quickly, Japan, which is a very crowded country, as you know, became a kind of a ghost country. I think this is the Shibuya Scramble Crossing, which is normally one of the most crowded places in the world. This is actually a scene from Wuhan Hospital. And then this is a picture that I actually took in Narita Airport quite late on in the pandemic, actually. But the whole country just closed down completely. Meanwhile, I was talking to my family and friends in the US and UK, and they're like, oh yeah, we're coming to Japan in 3 months, like wait for us. And I'm like, are you quite sure? I'm not so sure this is gonna happen. But anyway, and unfortunately, because my Wakayama group were quite elderly, that also closed down in, I think, February of 2020, and never really met again. I mean, it's only just getting started up again in the last few months. And so I more or less had to stop going to Wakayama, instead of which I was living in Kyoto. It's a beautiful city. People were staying off the streets. I was taking long walks on the Kamo River. And while I was doing so, I was remembering some of the famous poetry and so on about epidemics and disasters that have struck this city, which has been the victim of many disasters. So particularly well known is the Hojoki, which is a 12th century document which details dreadful epidemics, fires, and other disasters in Kyoto during the lifetime of its author. It's famous for its opening, which is very poetic. The flow of the river, i.e. this river, is ceaseless, and its water is never the same. The bubbles that float in the pools, now vanishing, now forming, are not of long duration. So in the world, a man and his dwellings. And it goes on to describe this awful epidemic accompanied by famine and starvation, in which the banks of this river are lined with the bodies of the victims. So I was, of course, thinking of all this as I was going on my walks, and hoping very much that it wasn't going to be quite like that this time around. In the end, of course, Japan had it relatively easy. COVID didn't hit the population nearly as badly, at least in the first year or two of the epidemic. So in the end, I actually ended up really watching with horror, like everyone else in the world, what was happening in other places, and including in the United States, where it seemed as though a variety of fears and disturbances just seem to be combining: political, economic, as well as disease related, to create this very dark period in 2020. And meanwhile, of course, I was reading and writing about the life of Koume, and I realized very quickly that many of the same things that I was seeing in the US and elsewhere in the world, this combination of disease, fear, foreign threat, political destabilization, and economic insecurity, were also very much a part of the story that I was reading. So I guess that's what I want to reflect on for the remainder of this little talk. And I'm going to focus mostly on the 1850s and 1860s, which were, as most of you probably know, were a period of great destabilization in Japan, starting in 1853 with the arrival of American warships threatening aggression if Japan didn't drastically change its policies regarding foreign trade, and eventually forcing Japan to open itself up to greatly expanded and uncontrolled trade, and culminating 15 years later in 1868 with a civil war and the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunal regime, which had ruled Japan for more than 250 years. So it was a very dramatic time, and of course, Koume was an observer of all of this and a participant in some ways in it. So I'll just give you a few vignettes, I guess, out of the diary to show you some of these parallels that I was seeing. I'll start in 1859. So I'm going to call this section "Taking to the Streets," because this is exactly one of the things that I found so baffling and confusing and worrying about what was going on in the United States during 2020, was that so many people responded to the lockdowns by marching in the streets, and of course there were very troubling political and social events that also contributed to this. So we had, I was watching, really at that very height of the pandemic, these enormous crowds marching for various reasons, protests, counter-protests, politics, and so on. There was also, of course, a lot of, very bizarre behavior going on that, was definitely puzzling. This, as you know, is a little bit later. And then there were, let's see, sorry, I'll just, yeah. So meanwhile, in 1859, back in Wakayama, trade had just begun with the opening of several ports to trade, and with the opening to trade also came an outbreak of cholera. It entered the country in 1858, and there was a major flare-up in the summer of 1858, and then again in 1859. I don't actually have Koume's diary for 1858, but in 1859, cholera was sweeping through the city of Wakayama. And you can, reading her diary, it's very easy to feel the fear and the helplessness in the face of this terrible epidemic. So Koume wrote in one entry, in this town, every house is displaying a condolence register, just among the ones I have heard of, and then she lists about 10 names of families that she knows well that have lost somebody. She says, I can hardly count them all. Mr. Toda, a friend of her family, was out fishing in the river just yesterday. While he was in his boat, his stomach felt bad. 3 hours after he got home, he started having attacks. He suffered 7 attacks altogether and then passed away. So I was experiencing the pandemic in Kyoto. She was experiencing this epidemic in Wakayama. And lo and behold, people were taking to the streets. It was known, I think, there was a sense that it was not a smart thing to do for people to mingle with each other too much. And she did mention that some neighborhoods blocked themselves off so that outsiders couldn't enter them. But at the same time, people didn't know what to do, like in order to deal with this sickness. And so they took to the streets, and she describes, I think a lot of it was perhaps religiously motivated, but she described how all of the shrines began organizing these huge processions in the hope, I think, that the gods would give them a break from this disease. And as a result, even though I think people recognized that big crowds were not a great idea, she describes how Wakayama every night was just crowded on these hot summer nights with huge crowds of people processing, even fighting each other as they vied, to have the biggest and the grandest procession. So she described it, everyone is calling on the gods, and the neighborhood groups are dancing in the streets. This evening, they're dancing in Komeyamachi and Yonchome. They were wearing gorgeous costumes. People really were vying to dress up as brightly as they could. In 4-chome, they're wearing tall hats like Shinto priests, otherwise going naked except for red loincloths, and wearing wooden clogs, geta, on one foot, and straw sandals, zori, on the other foot, taking the form of the god Uzume no Mikoto. Some are also wearing the ofuku masks, meaning like a plump-cheeked goddess masks. I could hear the banging of drums and bells. They are starting at the Ujigami shrines, then dancing on to 7 other shrines and ending up at the Nichizengu shrine. In the midst of all this marching and processing and dancing and strange behavior, Koume's own newly born grandchild became sick, as well as her husband. It's a little unclear what they had. The husband recovered. It sounded very much like he had a mild case of cholera. The grandchild, unfortunately, after a couple of weeks of severe illness, passed away at the age of 1. And so this was a very tragic time also for Koume. And So she describes very vividly the chaos out in the streets, the agony that they're experiencing at home, the terribly oppressive heat, and then after their grandchild died, the impossibility of finding anyone to help them with a funeral, because everyone was so busy building floats, and the carpenters were all working on the shrine floats. The people that they would normally hire to go in their funeral procession were all out dancing, so it was just a very, very sad and tragic time for her in the midst of all this. And these are actually images not from this epidemic, but just from Wakayama, even in a normal year, just showing some of these processions of naked people who it seems would were just processing in and out of these shrines as part of their annual celebrations. But these were out of season, these particular ones. I think they were specially put on. Okay, so that's taking to the streets. Then there's fake news. In the United States, of course, there were we were already, I think, in the midst of an epidemic of fake news, but I think that the pandemic made things much worse. There was, of course, the anti-vax movement, the anti-mask demonstrations. Of course, there was also political news, fake news of all sorts going around. There was QAnon peaking during this year. There was Pizzagate. There was, of course, election fraud accusations, and so on. Although the content was very different, the epidemic of inaccurate news was also very much a part of Koume's experience of this very insecure period, not only related to the epidemic, but more broadly to the political insecurity of this period. So news, this is a topic that actually really interested me as I was doing this research, is how did news and information circulate? There were no officially published newspapers, of course, no radio, of course. And much of them, the government was not keen at all on accurate news being circulated, and so much of what did circulate was underground. But there were these underground publications known as variously as Kawaraban or Chobokure that were, for the most part, that were focusing on drama and what we would think of as being very sensationalist kind of news. So the arrival of the foreigners was actually a bonanza for these. I mean, they loved these kinds of bizarre stories of any kind, apparently a half human, half cow that had been discovered somewhere. When the foreigners came, this was wonderful for the news media. They absolutely seized on it. There was vast imagery circulating within a very short time of the arrival of the foreign ship, some of it extremely sensationalist and wildly exaggerated. Come back to this one, sorry. When Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 on Japanese shores, the news of this event was absolutely rocked Japan all over the country. And it arrived, of course, slowly, not instantaneously. In the case of Wakayama, it took about 10 days for this news to arrive in Wakayama. And when it did come, it was extremely inaccurate. So what I noticed was that ultimately, the news media that were available at this time did provide relatively accurate news. I guess probably printed publications combined with word of mouth and so on. But certainly I was reading at the beginning just wildly exaggerated rumors that were being reported and that Koume was consuming and writing about in her diary. She obviously loved buying these or acquiring somehow or other these kinds of media, was reading them very avidly, reported on them all the time. So some of the rumors that she reported, for example, was that there were 90 foreign ships carrying 3,000 men each, waiting to attack Japan. There were actually about 6 ships at the time that she was writing. The English as well as the Americans were attacking Japan and ready to take it over. 50 or so British ships were approaching behind, I guess, the 90 or so American ones, that the British were going to be demanding an enormous requisition of Japanese rice every year. And I mean, actually, the shogun did in fact genuinely die during this period, a few weeks after the arrival of Matthew Perry, but her reporting on that was also extremely inaccurate. She wrote that he had been watching the arriving British fleet through a telescope when he fell off the tower, and that's why he had died. So there was all sorts of extraordinary news circulating. Some of the alarmist news was also very much, I guess, of the kind of, what's the word, sort of apocalyptic nature that was connected to natural phenomena. So for example, Koume reported that in some parts of the country, they had seen 3 suns in the sky at one time. She said that also many other strange things had been happening, terrible rains, people being struck by lightning. She reported a couple of times. She said, once she said, the public opinion is that it would be a good thing if an earthquake came, which it actually, funnily enough, did just a few months later, the Ansei earthquake. And then she also said at one point, she wrote, seems like the heavens have been taken over by dragons. So she was seeing a great deal of her own fears, I guess, were being reflected in natural phenomena and in a sense of some kind of great impending disaster, which was, as it turned out, not an altogether inaccurate picture of what was happening in Japan. Another thing that I found sort of fun about this was that she also, it seems like whenever these sensationalist news items were being reported, there was also a tremendous amount of satirical news items, sort of making fun of these same terrifying events, also circulating. Most of them are very difficult to translate into English because they're often in the form of clever puns and so on. I'll give you one example. So there was a rumor that somebody had left 2 daikon radishes outside the shogun's palace, each one with moxa, which was a curative medicine that people would burn on their skin. So it was burning on the daikon, let's see. Being the puns are too difficult, but a daikon, as you know, is a type of radish. A konkyu is a disaster. So she was saying that, and konkyu also means being treated with moxa. So she was saying that the meaning of these daikon radishes with the moxa was that Japan was about to experience a daikonkyu, i.e. a great disaster. She loved this stuff. She would report on it all the time, these puns. It was definitely part of the culture of the circulating news media. And I'll just also mention that as we know, a lot of the fake news circulating in the United States was being publicized by governments or being propagated by governments, whether friendly governments or political parties in waiting or unfriendly foreign governments. And I also did realize that Koume herself was the victim of a lot of official fake news. One particularly striking example, it was actually a couple of years before the arrival of the Americans in 1853, when the daimyo of her own domain died. And she has very vivid descriptions of this guy here, Tokugawa Harutomi. She has very vivid descriptions in her diary of the advancing sickness of this daimyo, the reports coming from the castle every day on his condition over a period of 2 months, and then finally on his death. And it was only reading the history books afterwards, the subsequently published history books that I have access to, that I understood that he had actually died 2 months before she started reporting on all of this, but that the authorities in the domain had kept his death secret so that they could then carry out a political purge on all their enemies before announcing the arrival of a new daimyo. So she had access only to very inaccurate news. Of course, social media was not available, but there were all sorts of other ways of making people feel that they scaring people with deceptive news. Actually, even after newspapers began publishing in Japan in the 1860s and 70s, it didn't really change. There was still, the news was still very, very, very hard to rely on. So then another phenomenon that we saw in America in 2020 was this outbreak of racism, fear-based xenophobia, and so on, which took the form of xenophobic protests, fascist street marches, and so on and so forth. I would say there was something a little bit similar in Japan during the 1850s and early 1860s. Fear of foreigners was definitely a very prevailing phenomenon. So some of this was expressed in the same kind of alarmist images that I was showing you before. This is one of the crew members on Commodore Perry's ship being portrayed in sort of dramatized Japanese media, apparently reflecting these sort of goblin-like tengu that were very, very popular in Japanese folk culture. There were also actual incidents that provoked alarm across the country, including in Wakayama. In the case of Wakayama, a ship moored, a foreign ship moored close to the capital city. And shortly after arriving, a 14-year-old girl was apparently abducted by the sailors on the ship, went onto the ship for a few days and then was released after clearly having been severely abused. So Koume, in commenting on this, was of course very, very resentful and also fearful. The authorities ordered people from Wakayama not to go anywhere near any foreigners. But nevertheless, some of these kinds of incidents were being reported. She also reported on a lot of stories that were circulating about foreigners that mostly focused on their avarice, their greed, their contempt for Japanese customs and so on. I'll just give you a couple of examples. In one case, she wrote about a foreigner who in Wakayama, apparently, who was trying to persuade a local metal worker that he could train him in order to turn bronze into gold. So he was trying to persuade him that he should buy up bronze and melt it down into gold, which I have no idea how he was supposed to do that, but it is true that foreign traders were very keen to buy up Japanese copper and other metals in order to export them. On another occasion, Koume wrote about a foreigner who purchased a performing monkey from a local performer. This is common for street performers to have these monkeys. But instead of using it for its skills, instead he had his Chinese servant boil it up and then ate its brains cut off the top of its head and ate its brains. So this was, she says, even the Chinese cook was horrified at being asked to do such a thing. And she actually, although she really, I don't think, had a very strong sense of Japan or Japaneseness, she was much more a citizen of Wakayama than of Japan. This made her a lot more patriotic than she might otherwise have been. And she actually ended that same year of complaining about all these foreign things the foreigners were getting up to with a little poem that she either wrote herself or quoted. If they stop hiding in the shadows and come into the light of the land of the rising sun, they will melt those ships from America. This is just an illustration from a local, from a Wakayama, sorry, from a Yokohama pamphlet that was published showing another slightly revolting aspect of foreign culture, i.e. butchering cows for eating. So these are American butchers who had opened a shop in Yokohama. The economic woes and insecurity. So I think I might, just looking at the clock, I might just pass over this and just say that Japan, just like the United States, experienced very high inflation, very high unemployment, and great economic dislocation formed by not only the epidemic, but mostly by the arrival of the foreigners. And for the most part, Koume blamed, correctly, I think, blamed the foreigners for this. And I'll finish with just one other I guess, that seemed to be a little reminiscent between the two areas, and that is attacks on the central government. So, of course, we have all these incredibly alarming scenes going on in the United States in January of 2021, right? At the same time, I was reading about Koume's experience in the 1860s in response to the growing destabilization of the country. So actually, this story started a little bit earlier. So even in the 1850s, with the arrival of the foreigners, the domain, which had been very peaceful for over 200 years, had to figure out how to defend itself. So there was a process of militarization that started earlier. And since Koume came from the samurai class, her own family was very much affected by this. Even though they were scholars, her husband and son had to go back into military training, buy new equipment, and so on. And they were both useless. I mean, the father had the father, at the time that he only once had to go and actually fight in a campaign, which ironically wasn't against foreigners, but against rebellious Japanese in the mid-1860s. They were utterly humiliated in battle, and they fought one little skirmish, and they were routed by this actual rabble, actually, not even a very trained army of rebels. But by that time, the husband, who was fighting in this, and he was 70 years old and had never fought a thing in his life. But he did actually write an account of it. He was the only written record of this humiliation was actually written by him. So I guess he did some good. Wakayama belonged to the Tokugawa family, so of course they were on the line to help protect the Tokugawa regime against these outside threats. The threats actually were somewhat similar to the ones that were going on in the United States in 2020 and 2021. The rebels, most of whom were from relatively isolated domains in the far west of Japan, figured out pretty early on that taking over the capital, meaning in this case the emperor himself and his physical body, would be an effective strategy for taking control of the whole country. And so the attacks on the imperial palace in Kyoto began in the mid-1860s, which resulted in great destruction to the city of Kyoto, and then continued through the end of the decade. Although Koume was not present in Kyoto to watch this, many of her families that she knew from Wakayama were in the Kyoto, Osaka area trying to defend the Tokugawa regime against these threats. But the threats themselves, as she described them, again, was sort of not totally unreminiscent of the kinds of threats that we were reading about or watching in the American media. So the men from these Western domains were being described as extremely barbaric, extremely kind of disregardful for samurai traditions and so on. She gives one description which gives some sense of the kind of fear and alarm that people in Wakayama were feeling. This was in 1867. She writes, on the 23rd of last month, a large band of men marched in front of the gates of Choshu's domain in Osaka. This was one of these Western domains that was plotting to overthrow the shogunate. It said that a headquarters has been established at Tennozan and that more soldiers are gathering there. There is a company of women soldiers and also of one of monks who eat meat, take wives, and allow their hair to grow. They're wearing armor and carrying pikes and swaggering around with no one to stop them. There are reports of armed clashes in Kyoto. It's said that the emperor has ordered the expulsion of the foreigners, and it's also said that a large band of vagabond soldiers has gathered at Senju in Edo, up in the Tokyo area. 1,000 of them are said to have gathered at the estate of the Lord of Mito, and more are pouring in. It's said that in Edo, people are wearing their winter kimono linings, and in Nikko, it has been snowing. This is in July that she's writing this. I don't know if it's true, but really every day we hear nothing but disturbing rumors. Just on the point about marching in the streets and sort of displays of exaggerated celebration in the face of disastrous events, something like this happened again. So it happened during the epidemic in 1859, but it happened again in 1867. And this was a phenomenon that took place throughout Japan. Huge crowds of people began dancing through the streets, claiming that amulets, religious amulets, were falling out of the sky. This has often been described as a kind of a millenarian movement in the face of great disaster. Koume observed it by report from Kyoto, and then again at first hand in Wakayama. It spread throughout the country. So she actually has a lot of very vivid descriptions of this, but I'll just give you one description that was from a letter written to her from Kyoto, just to give you some sense of what it felt like. This was at a time when the city was about to erupt in civil war. In fact, just a month or so later, the Tokugawa regime was overthrown in one climactic battle. In the houses on which the divine images have fallen, as I said, they were falling out of the sky, reportedly. They are displaying decorations of bamboo grass, erecting sacred ropes, and making offerings of rice cakes, sake, fish, and sweets. Family members are gathering in the towns, wearing layers of clothes, winter jackets, yuzen silk, and dappled kanoko cloth, all costing 11 or 12 ryo each. I should mention that Koume's family income was 50 ryo a year, but they were lucky to actually get paid it though because of the economic problems. So this was a lot of money in her mind. Wealthier people are wearing 5 or 6 layers of clothing at once. Their bright red clothes cost over 100 ryo. Women are dressing as men and men as women, and they are behaving in all sorts of strange ways. They are playing flutes, shamisen, and drums, ringing bells, cheering and dancing as they shout, "Yoi janaika, which means everything's okay, isn't it? Everyone, even strangers and samurai, are holding the hands of the people they meet in the street and saying, let's dance, as they dance through the streets. The sound of their celebration starts around noon and continues till 2 or 3 in the morning. You would never think that we are expecting a war here." And similarly, a few days later in Wakayama, sacred paper and images of daikoku have been falling. The people have been drinking sake, and from early evening, they can be heard dancing in the streets. It's said that the authorities have scolded them. When they catch people dancing, they are fining them, that the women dancing with their hair finely decorated, and when the officials scold them for their extravagant display, they take the officials' hands and say, instead of saying such things, why don't you dance with us? And many other stories she tells. So actually, her diary ends at the end of the Japanese calendar year equivalent, 1867. 3 days after the end of her diary for this year, this climactic battle takes place, which overthrew the Tokugawa regime. Unfortunately, the diary is missing for the next 7 years and doesn't pick up again until well into the new regime. So actually, this is exactly where she leaves the crisis on this millenarian dancing. And it's where I'm going to leave this set of vignettes. Thank you very much.
Anybody have questions? Who wants to go first? I would like to remind everybody that's listening and watching online that I'm monitoring questions. So if you have any, drop them in the chat.
I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this project, by the way. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, you said that she was a scholar and her father was a scholar, a family of scholars. I'm kind of assuming that most of the people were illiterate at that time. Is that right?
I don't think that is totally accurate. No, I mean, of course, there was plenty of illiteracy out there, and there was a lot of poverty also. But every study that has been performed of education levels in Japan at this time is surprising in terms of the extent of literacy. So most of the samurai class, of course, were literate, which was that's about 6% of the population. But in addition, there had been a great deal of wealth creation among the merchant class. And ironically, even more than the samurai, this particular group were also quite keen on educating their daughters because, you know, for women in merchant families, it was quite important to be able to contribute to the family business through, for example, bookkeeping and keeping records and so on and so forth. So although Koume is extremely literate, she's utterly innumerate. She has no idea how to use an abacus or any of those kinds of what we would call common arithmetical skills. That kind of literacy is also really quite common in other parts of Japan. And there have been, you know, it's very hard to estimate, you know, statistically what the literacy rate in Japan was, but I've seen estimates from this period that it was over 30% and much higher in some parts of the country.
So what I was curious about is that how would these scholars get paid? Who would pay them?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way this family's economy worked was that they received a hereditary stipend from the domain, or as members of the samurai elite, they were entitled to that. It was a pretty small amount, and the domain was actually in big financial trouble, so it never paid them more than about half of what it theoretically was supposed to. So that was the kind of the core of their income, and then on top of that, they based on the husband's position as a scholar in the school, he received a supplemental salary for that. And then on top of that, they had to do whatever they could to enhance their income. And it's actually a topic that really interested me in researching this book. And so my book actually talks a lot about their household economy. Koume was herself a contributor to this. And her husband would take in students, you know, to give them private tuition and so on. So there were bits and drabs of money coming in from all sorts of other places, yeah. And it wasn't only money. A lot of the economy was also in kind. They had to really scrape. I mean, they were definitely not well off, but they were resourceful and pulled in income from a variety of sources. When the Tokugawa fell in 1868, the system of domain stipends was abolished soon afterwards. So these hereditary and guaranteed incomes were disappeared. And also the domain school was abolished. So the family had a lot of adjusting to do. And that's another part of the story, which I won't go into now.
We do have a question from online. Did Koume ever think anyone would read and care about her diary? Do we know why she wrote it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would wish I knew the answer to that. She very seldom commented on the keeping of the diary, only once or twice. Later in her life, much later, when she was an elderly lady, she did comment. She commented that she had been reading through the early part of the diary, and she really felt like nobody remembered this anymore, and she would like to leave a record of it. She seemed to be hinting that she wanted to write a book or something, as opposed, maybe using her diary, but that's all. So diary keeping was very common in Japan, but usually by men. And in most cases, I think the diary was a kind of a business record of the family's daily activities, where financial transactions would be recorded, where social interactions and particularly social obligations would be recorded. And that was usually the husband or the father's domain. But I think that Koume's diary, for whatever reasons, does many of those functions. So she does record in quite a bit of detail financial transactions that the family was involved in, although she gets very confused about the numbers. And she also has a very detailed accounts of social interactions, and particularly of sort of obligations. If somebody gave them something, she needed to keep a record to make sure that the family would, in return, do something for those people. This was a huge part of the family's economy, was actually this kind of non-cash, sort of mutual obligation type of economy that brought them in real material benefits of one kind or another. So I think that may have been another big motivation. But another thing that it really speaks to that I find just interesting, but it's hard to know exactly how to interpret. This is not only a record of her activities, but of the entire household. So her husband as well as her son. They were a small family. That was her husband, son, later on son's wife and kids, and until she passed away, Koume's mother was also living with them. But the one who was out the most was actually the husband, because he had this busy job as a scholar and eventually as the head of the domain school. So probably 60% of what she was writing about was actually about what he was up to. So for some reason, she had decided to take control of recording the entire family's interactions. And it's interesting to me, like what that says about her relationship with her husband. Among other things, it suggests that she must have sat down with him every day and gone over in some detail, like what he was up to during the day. I have no idea, of course, how honest he was with her. But I mean, sometimes she expressed like real annoyance at what he was getting up to. Like he loved, this whole family actually loved to drink, but particularly him. So one of the interesting things about their household economy is like how little cash they had and how much of it they spent on sake. I mean, really like an enormous amount. But she didn't like it when he and his friends, like went out drinking all night and he came home totally smashed at 3 in the morning. No, I don't think any spouse likes that. And she did get a little stroppy about that. But nevertheless, I think overall they had this quite unusual relationship that was very rich in communication. And the other purpose that this diary seems to serve is as a kind of information central for all of the flow of information that was coming into her household from so many different sources, from these broadsheets and so on, and sort of pseudo newspapers, from visitors, local visitors, visitors from out of town, from local gossip, from what her husband had picked up, during his work at the castle and elsewhere. And she recorded it all, sometimes like copying whole stretches of the news and so on. And it's unusual. I've never seen a woman's diary that does anything similar to that.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a 7th-year doctoral student in the art history department here. Thank you for your presentation. Just to follow up on this kind of interesting discussion about diary, because I have to say I was very happy to become familiar with this artist and not aware of her work at all. But that word diary, I initially, just because it's a woman and diary, I made the assumption that it was going to be her secrets and, you know, her darkest and like her passions. And that doesn't seem to be at all what it was. And just wondering, the physical papers, was the term diary used on the kind of front page, or some sort of word to indicate that this is a book for this type of journaling? Or
Yeah, I think the word Nikki was used. I don't remember whether she wrote it on the front page or not, to tell you the truth, but it was commonly used at this time, yes.
and Nikki,
And it was also, she would purchase a volume each year, and she would start a new volume at the beginning of the next year. So it was clearly like an annual record, you know, with daily entries that she was keeping. So it was consciously a diary, yes. Yeah. Does that answer the question? But let me just add though that, so women's diaries were quite common actually in the Tokugawa period, but they were usually much more, but they were seldom of the kind that you mentioned, of like my deepest thoughts and that kind of thing. That's unusual in any aspect of Japanese diary keeping, but they were often sort of literary diaries that contained poetry, and often poetic accounts of travel, that kind of thing, that clearly were being written for some kind of circulation. And so it was a recognized genre. Yeah. And I must say, Koume's diary also contains a lot of poetry. She was a trained poet as well as an artist. But that does not seem to have been the function similar to these literary diaries. Yeah, I would call it very different from those. Thank you, Elizabeth.
I just had a question about, do you have any estimate, first of all, how many total words there are in an average year? And second of all, how much time each day she spent on this?
I mean, yeah, I cannot cite any statistics for you, John, but she got wordier and wordier as the years went on. So she was clearly a compulsive diary keeper. Like the first year of this diary dates from 1837, when she was in her early 30s, but it was clearly in midstream. She'd obviously been keeping it already for a while, and the last year is, I think, 1882. So she's keeping it over this period of over 50 years, and we only have 17 years surviving, thank God in some ways, because it's a lot of reading and a lot of quite difficult Japanese to take on board. But definitely, you know, one year in the whole 17 years fills up 3 volumes of printed Japanese. So that gives you a sense that it's not, you know, it's not like 3 volumes per year or anything like that. But the entries some of them are really long. Yeah, not a great answer, but.
So we've got one more online real quick. I think it'll be a short one, and then I'll pass it over. So you did sort of touch base that it does still survive, her journal, her diary does. And if so, what's the physical format of it right now?
So I can just go back. Diary right now is sitting in the prefectural library of Wakayama Prefecture. And it's available for anybody to go and look at. And it's many more than 17 volumes in the format that she wrote it. So 1 year might actually occupy several volumes, depending on the year. So this is the physical format of the surviving diary. As I mentioned, it was transcribed by her great-grandson and published in three printed volumes, which I don't have an image of. I don't have other pictures to show you of this, but by the way, sorry, I'm looking at the cover now. It doesn't actually use the word Nikki that I can see, but it does actually. Sorry, yeah, those last 2 on the bottom left. Yeah, Koume Nikki. And then if you look at that, just to give you an example of the daily format. So each of these circles is 1 day in the diary. She always starts with a description of the weather, which is universal for Japanese diary keeping. She had her own little, she was actually very interested, I think, in sort of heavens and astronomy and so on. She likes that kind of thing. She had her own little sort of code for describing the weather. So like a plain circle meant fine weather. This meant, partly cloudy. Black meant bad weather. And there were a few other little code items as well. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's how the diary appears. This is, by the way, even for a trained historian, this is extremely hard to read. It needs years of special training to read this kind of manuscript document. So I would never have attempted this if this was all there was. But even the published one uses a lot of very unusual kanji characters that are open to different interpretation. It's not an easy document to deal with. In that sense, I'm glad this project is done.
So what was it that connected you with her and changed the rest of your life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, thank you for asking that question. I love talking about this. So this is actually the fourth biography of an otherwise unknown individual that I have written. I've really devoted the last 20 years of my career to doing this kind of work. I've also written one about a resident of Durham. I have a sense of mission about it, I think. I feel that these voiceless people who have been forgotten by history really deserve to be brought back and given some sort of a voice, and particularly because they were, generally relatively powerless as they were surrounded by these quite major events that have been, really from 1850 till 1950, Japan has been just one major, disaster or great event after another, and as well as enormous social and economic transformations. And so to me, it's been a mission to kind of portray how this was experienced by people who just simply lived it, who didn't really have any influence over how to make this history. And I'm very fascinated by questions as to, I guess the sort of cliched way to put it is agency. It really, very often these people had no choice about being caught up in these events and how they might have had to react. So, no choice but to join the military, no choice but to support the government, all those kinds of things. But I'm very fascinated by when they did have a choice, what choices they made. And that's kind of really what I'm trying to do in most of these projects is to show that. And so I'm really looking for people who are at the lower margins of society, but of course they had to be literate in order, for the most part. I've done one oral history in Japan and one in Durham. So obviously that opens up a new avenue for this kind of research. But diaries are really the best way into this, although collections of letters are also useful. So the first of these four that I've done in Japan was a woman's history. But I feel like in retrospect, there are so many ways I might have done it other than the way I did do it. So I've always reflected on that. And then I did these two guys. Each time I've gone backwards in history so that I can kind of reflect the entire modern history of Japan and even a little bit before through these stories that I'm telling. Most recently, I had published the story of a male merchant, I guess a villager who had lived through actually sort of a similar period to Koume. But I felt like I really wanted to try my hand at another woman's story because, well, in the project that I was just doing on this Yokohama, this villager and merchant, there were plenty of women in the story, but I found that by the end I knew nothing about them. Like he was married, he had daughters, I didn't know their names, I really knew nothing about them. And it was just very clear that it's much harder to get at women's stories, and so I wanted to have another try because obviously if you're looking at how history was experienced by people, half of people, and these stories are very important. And So then I actually went on a sort of conscious hunt for 19th century women that I might be able to write about. And I was lucky, I think, to stumble on this diary fairly shortly into my search for those kinds of sources. I actually, once I had started this, I realized, somewhat to my discomfort, that, and it makes sense, right? Anybody who's actually does women's history, particularly in the early modern period, is probably going to be doing this kind of work, writing, using diaries and so on, because there are so few, like, great women of history in this period who might have left political records or other records in the broader archives. And so if you want to know about women, you probably have to go to diaries. So surprising, rather to my surprise, I guess, having been, like, I feel, the only person doing this kind of work in modern Japanese history, I realized that for early modern Japanese women's history, there are a bunch of them out there. So there are actually quite a lot of really wonderful biographies of fairly unknown women that have been written for this exact period. So it was very intimidating for me to step into that, and also humbling in lots of ways. So I think for that reason, it was the most difficult of the biographies that I've written. And I'm glad it's over, but I'm also glad that I did it. Thanks for the question.
So I know we've gone over, so I know some of you probably have to slide out. We have one last question online, if you have a brief moment for it. Does she ever reference other famous diaries? Oh, I cannot pronounce this other individual's name. There you go, thank you. Or diaries of her contemporaries. Did she refer to herself as part of the literary diary tradition in Japan?
Definitely not, no. I mean, she clearly had read this stuff. She was well educated, but she did not see herself as a part of that tradition. I can be reasonably sure about that. So she did slot herself into an intellectual and artistic tradition and cultural tradition of female poets and artists. So Murasaki Shikibu, would be an example of that. But she didn't, diaries were not her way into that. Rather, it was her practice, I think, that was her connection to that. So she, even as an artist, and this is a whole other part of the project that I haven't talked about at all, but even as an artist, she was surprisingly, I guess, non-referential. She would refer to her own teachers, who were male teachers within the Wakayama domain. But even though there were other female artists working in Wakayama, she almost never talks about them. There's only one description in the diary of an encounter with another artist, another female artist. And it surprised me in all sorts of ways, because actually this was quite a well-known local artist who was also very well-known. So Koume's name means little plum, and she was actually quite well-known for her paintings in the sort of traditional Chinese style of flowers, and particularly plum blossoms. She did a lot of those. And this other artist painted, and who she met, who was maybe a little bit older than her, had similar teaching, similar lineage in terms of teachers and so on. Also was well known for painting plum blossoms. You would think that they would be like best friends, but they were meeting for the first time quite late in life. And this other artist was actually came from a merchant family and not from a samurai family, and so was not part of the samurai sort of cultural elite necessarily. She had her own lifestyle, I guess, that was a little bit different. Nevertheless, she was a noted local artist. What really struck me though was they went on an outing together to the beach and took a picnic and everything. And what Koume mostly wrote about was like how miserable her picnic lunch was compared to this lady's. This lady, like her servant, had packed her this incredible sushi lunch, with fresh shrimp and all these lovely, luxury items, whereas poor Koume, who had a rather Spartan diet for the most part, saving all the money for sake, I guess. But she, you know, she had she had taken like three-day-old, you know, like you know, sort of rice and pickled fish, you know, and this kind of really rather dismal. So that seemed to be what struck her more than anything. I mean, it says something, I think, about the sort of common culture that was also increasingly being embraced by various social classes that didn't necessarily always come together. It was a very uncomfortable experience for her to meet this other artist. I didn't really answer the question at all, but thanks for it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.